Welcome to Transform Your Workplace. I'm Brandon Laws, your host. Today's episode is brought to you by Xenium HR. Right now, Xenium's running its annual What People Want from Work survey. This is an employee engagement survey that's free to participate. All you need to do is have one representative from your organization sign up. We'll send you the survey link, the instructions, an email template you can send out to your employees. You send it out. We'll collect the survey responses. We'll calculate the results, and we'll stack you up against the survey population. You get a report by November 1st, 2024 with your results, and you can use that information to help shape your workplace culture in a positive way. Go sign up at xeniumhr.com. Okay, today's episode features Kathi Enderes. Kathy's the Senior VP of Research and Global Industry Analyst at the Josh Bersin Company, and is the co-author of the Definitive Guide to Human Resources. This is introducing a concept called systemic HR. And Kathi Enderes and Josh Bersin make the argument that systemic HR plays a critical role in addressing the modern challenges such as hybrid work, artificial intelligence, leadership development. And so they're asking us to think about HR differently. They're saying it's more important than ever before. It's one of the most important functions within an organization, they argue. So I think you're going to get a lot out of this. We cover a lot of ground in this episode. We'll put a link to the full report in the show notes. Enjoy the conversation with Kathi Enderes of the Josh Bersin Company. Kathi, it's a pleasure to have you on Transform Your Workplace. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Brandon. Happy to be here.
Yeah, and we're here to talk about the Definitive Guide to Human Resources, and we're specifically talking about systemic HR. This is a model that the Josh Bersin Company came up with. A lot of research went into this, and I'm sure you're probably exhausted from all that research you did. But let's just start with the HR role has changed a lot over the many, many decades that this function's existed. How has it expanded over time?
Yeah, if you think back on the HR function, how it started out, it was really a back office function, very administrative, very compliance oriented, and really if you think back maybe even 50, 100 years ago, it was kind of just there basically to handle hiring people, paying people, and that was pretty much it, right? So it was very kind of administrative, not very business oriented, and not very important in the business kind of overall area. But now, of course, as we're thinking about all the problems that HR is there to address, so you think about things like hybrid work, for example. We never had to think about that. We think about culture and owning the culture and driving the culture forward. We're thinking about things like health and well-being. Now, I know this month there's lots of talk about mental health and mental well-being. There's lots of talk about, of course, leadership development, developing leaders and leadership capabilities in the organization. Or if you think about the 5 generations we have now in the workplace, or you think about AI and how we're helping the organization adapt to AI. If you think about all of those things, they're much different than the things that the HR function of yesteryear basically had to address, where it was more about the personnel function, right? That said, well, we're just keeping the company out of trouble. We're making sure that laws are followed. All of this is, of course, important. And of course, people need to get paid, but there's so much more. So HR function has really evolved and has to evolve to take advantage really of all of the things that, the opportunities that come towards a company in today's world.
I think about how HR has evolved. In my network, there's a lot of small, medium-sized organizations that I'm interacting with, and oftentimes they only have one HR person, maybe a few. And I often am concerned with how they have to keep up with the evolving needs of this function. And I'm sure at the larger organization, there's layers and they can have a function built out. But I worry, how do they keep up? There's so many needs for this function. And I'm wondering how you think they can keep up.
Well, it's tough, right? I mean, when you look actually at at burnout rates, for example, study after study show that employees are burned out, but HR people are even more burned out, much more burned out actually than their employee population, because they have to take care of all the employee things, but their employees themselves as well. So many HR people are actually pretty overwhelmed with all of this, because every day there's some new study that comes around, whether that's on hybrid work or whether that's on like using AI or any of these new topics, basically. Or if you think about the pandemic, for example, suddenly HR had to be experts on distancing and masks and all of those and keeping people from dying, basically. Like, it's a huge responsibility if you think about that, right? That they never had to do before. So HR really needs a lot of support. Most of the HR organizations are actually not good at supporting HR in developing their own capabilities. I mean, in our study, we saw that only 7% actually have a professional development program at all for their HR people. And they also spend less money on HR development than they spend on their employees. We were talking with a very large consulting company, and they told us, well, they are spending, I think, $5,000 a year on their consulting, like their consultants, basically development, on their client-facing consultants. Guess how much they spend on HR's development?
I couldn't even guess.
Yeah, it's
way
like less than 500. So it's less than a tenth, basically, of what they spend for everybody else. Well, how can HR actually support the organization to move into this new world with all of these like big topics that have like really significant impacts when we're not developing them? So most organizations are very far away from like really putting the importance behind that opportunity that they have to develop HR people in all of these new capabilities, all of these new areas.
Yeah, one of the new areas that I know is on the minds of a lot of people is artificial intelligence. How is AI and other technologies disrupting the HR function, and how are HR people like adapting to this new world?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's really two ways that HR can add huge value on, like in the AI area. One of them is, of course, using AI in HR. So using AI for recruiting, using AI for performance management, for succession management, for coaching, for leadership development, for kind of compensation and pay equity and all of those kind of things, which is a big opportunity in itself. And organizations are already going there. The other even bigger opportunity is how can HR help the organization actually adapt the organization models, their jobs, the skills of every single employee to work with AI, together with AI on the team for every single job. Because every single job, not just HR jobs, every single job will change. And who can really think about the skills and the capabilities and the jobs and the roles? Well, HR needs to do this because IT won't do it, right? IT won't do it. IT thinks about the tech and how does the tech fit into the tech stack. And operations can't really do it themselves because operations is doing operations, right? If you're a nurse, for example, in a healthcare organization, you can't really redesign your job while you're caring for your patients because you're caring for the patients, right? And that happens, of course, in manufacturing, in any kind of industry. So there's really these two areas where HR has a huge opportunity, both to fine tune and improve the HR function, but then also help the organization embrace AI. And HR, I think, to your second part of the question, how prepared is HR? I think HR is getting more and more prepared. A couple of years ago, when we started talking about, maybe just 1.5 years ago, when generative AI, ChatGPT came into the market with the big bang, right? I heard a lot of angst, and we talk a lot with HR leaders and HR teams. Everybody was so confused. Everybody was so concerned. Everybody said, what's happening? Is it going to come from my job? Is it going to come replace learning and development? Is it going to replace recruiting? How do I deal with all of these issues of data privacy and all of that? And now I think the sentiment has changed because people have realized kind of the genie is out of the bottle, right? So you can't put it back into the bottle. So the genie is out of the bottle and we better work with it rather than like just try to push it away. So I see now a lot more positive excitement about it on kind of how can we use AI both on the HR side and then on the organizational side. So I think the function is coming up to speed with that. And we have actually created our own generative AI assistant for HR. It's called Galileo. And we fed it all of our research that we have, all of our frameworks, all of our insights. We even feed it outside data but only vetted data from some of our vendor partners on like compensation benchmarks or something like that, or employment laws. And HR people can ask any kind of question. It could be a consultant, it could be kind of a search machine, but it also could be a coach for HR. And it knows things that we haven't specifically written because it can generate, of course, all of these insights. And when we started out with that, there was a lot of concern from people that said, well, I don't really know even what to ask it, or I don't know how to use it. More and more people say, oh, well, now I've started using it. It's actually really useful. And I'm incorporating that into my daily life and into my, like every day I want to use it and ask it questions that people ask me. I can ask Galileo and find case studies and examples and all of that.
I think it's an incredible thing about technology is a lot of times, like, especially with the disruptive technology like this, you're like, wow, it's scary and exciting. And I think when you haven't developed use cases for it yet, you're like, what am I supposed to do with this? And it's a little disruptive to like your work. But when you start like really understanding that it's not going away and we need to adapt and start to figure out use cases for it, creating the GPT, like your example, that's genius. I mean, like to feed it research that you've already done so it's useful in finding information a lot quicker. That is smart. I mean, that's where HR people need to go, is like think about how they can use these tools to be more efficient and more effective ultimately at the end of the day.
That's right. Yeah, and you said it exactly right. More efficient and more effective. So companies are experimenting with both of these, right? So they're using their own kind of generative AI pilots. For example, Walmart has created one internally, and I know Walmart is massive and all of that, and they had a 60,000 people pilot of their headquarters employees, because of course they're Walmart and they have 2.2 million employees. But they are using it for both the efficiency of HR, what they have created, because they say, well, it actually can do things like answer questions that people have on what's my PTO plan, or what's my benefits plan, or any of those kind of things, or why was my pay like this at this pay period? Shouldn't I have overtime? Like those kind of things. Of course, that generative AI can get much better accuracy than kind of a call center employee, because it can generate it can absorb so much more data than a person can. So you're using it for efficiency, but then also for effectiveness of HR. So they're using it also. Can we maybe use it to coach managers or something like that? When they have a tough employee situation, for example, they say, well, my employee is always coming in late. How should I work with them? How should I coach them? Then it can also help with those kind of things. So both the efficiency and the effectiveness, it can do many things. At
the heart of this guide that you co-authored with Josh Bersin, you introduce systemic HR. It's a new operating model for HR, and you argue like the traditional models need to kind of go away, and we need to adopt this new systemic HR model. What are the key differences between traditional models versus what you're proposing?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the traditional models are really kind of what we call the 1980s IT department, right? Because and the reason why we're saying that is basically somebody has a question, they call up and they say, well, I have a problem. And then the HR function gets into gear and says, okay, there's this problem. Who's going to handle that? And you work it through kind of different levels of tiers of delivery, and if like the lowest level can't support the problem, it gets escalated, and then you work off the problem. But it's very reactive, of course, because all the things that we talked about, all these problems and opportunities that HR can work on, they're not problems that somebody calls up about, right? These are massive business transformations. These are like new skills that people need, new like organization models. So the systemic HR kind of function is much more business oriented. it really creates their their HR strategy from the business strategy, rather than saying, well, this is just about efficient service delivery. It's really about adding value to the business itself. It has much broader skills that HR people have. So we talked about like the problems of developing skills in HR. The HR people in systemic HR need to not just understand one domain, but also have a good understanding of all of the domains of HR, in addition to understanding the business. So if they're a learning and development person, just understanding learning and development is not enough, because what about recruiting, right? If you want to build skills, you also need to understand, how do we hire for these skills? For example, you also need to understand performance management, because you need to understand how we evaluate these skills that people have. You also need to understand rewards, for example, a little bit, because how do we reward and recognize people for building new skills? Diversity, equity, and inclusion, you need to understand too, because you need to understand, for example, where people, like where you have like inclusion challenges, or how your learning and development opportunities are maybe equitable or not. So soon enough, you see, well, just having one domain specialization is not enough. In addition to the specializations that we need also all these, what we call full stack HR capabilities. So building those as well. The role of the HR business partners is fundamentally different. Such an important role in systemic HR, apart from the CHRO. It's the most important and most impactful role, because they're really the ones that consult or should consult with the business on all of these kind of big topics. If the business says we need to expand into a new geography, we need to transform digitally, for example, as Lego did, they said we need to be a much more digital company, you know, the Lego blocks. But they said kids also want to play digitally more and more. Of course, there's much more things online. We're not set up for that. So they said, well, HR can really help us with that. And so they rethought also their HR business partner role, for example. So the roles of the HR business partners, and all roles really. And I think maybe the most important thing is, rather than working in these functional silos to solve problems, much more integrated. That's what we call it systemic, right? Because every problem that we have is just a symptom, but we need to address it from all different perspectives of HR. Any kind of problem that we have in HR or that comes to us is not a single domain problem, right? If you say, for example, we have a skills shortage in a certain area, we miss AI skills, which everybody does today. Well, who can address that? It can't just be recruiting, because maybe there's just not enough people out there. You also need to think about, how do we develop the people that we already have? How do we reward and retain and recognize people for developing these skills? And might we have to redesign jobs and roles and organization models basically to support all of that? So those are just a few things. And then maybe the last thing, data and technology and analytics, hugely important in systemic HR. So because all of these problems that we are talking about now, and all of the skills challenges that we have right now, you can't really solve them without getting data and analytics behind it and using technologies, HR technologies, in new ways.
In the guide, you highlight dimensions of HR. HR's got a huge job. The function itself, there's so many dimensions to it, so many layers. You highlight like most important dimensions to the least important, and there are a couple key ones that are like the most important. What were some of those?
Yeah, so the most important ones were around basically the HR and business strategy being fully integrated, and also developing your HR function that's culturally aligned to what the culture of the organization is. So it's less it can't be maybe like as it used to be, a drag and drop model. Here's the HR model maybe of Microsoft or something, and we could say, well, I'm using the same model, because your company, if you're from another company, is not Microsoft, right? You have very different business, very different culture, all of that. So having that kind of business alignment and cultural alignment, and really like fit for purpose HR strategy and HR service delivery model, really, really important. Other things that are really important are HR technology, as I mentioned before, like HR technology being business aligned, focusing on the right strategic work, building capabilities, building the right HR capabilities, very, very important, Because if the HR doesn't have the capabilities, they can't really execute on the right roles, right, that we are designing. So these new roles, these more business integrated roles, you need the capabilities for it as well. Using technology, HR technology, for creating great employee experiences, not just being efficient in HR, another really important dimension of that as well. So yeah, we saw there's 18 dimensions that we lined out, but the ones that really matter most is like this business alignment, building capabilities, and using technology and AI actually in the right way as well.
Here's a bold statement I pulled from the guide. You said the HR function is now the most important business function, but progress towards systemic HR is slow and uneven. Elaborate on that statement for me.
Okay, so the first part, can we say that the HR function is the most important business function? And that's a little bit controversial, of course, but it used to be that the CFO was like the right-hand person to the CEO, right? But that was more like what we call an industrial model, because in an industrial model, the success of a company was really dependent on like your financial performance only. Like, where did you have locations? Where do you have like sites, for example, like the physical assets that the company had. But now this is all kind of table stakes in a way, right? And physical assets, you could argue, even some companies are fully virtual, right? So you don't need now sites at all. So it's all about the IP. It's all about the culture and the people, because who owns the IP? It's all about the people, right? And more people are actually, of course, now today, rather than 50 years ago or even 30 years ago, people can move around very quickly. So if you're not working on the culture, if you're not creating a great work environment, people will just go somewhere else, and they're going to take all of their skills with them. And then you're going to lose as a company the IP, which is the most important asset that you have, right? So that's what we're saying. HR is actually now the most important function there. It used to be like in the maybe 70s to maybe 2020, what used to be the CIO that was really important, because it was all about tech. But now we see even the tech is getting more and more table stakes. It's getting more and more commoditized, and HR is really the ones that help, like the CEO and the board, kind of nurture a great company, and the company's success is really kind of dependent on that. So that's why we say the HR function is really the most important one. And we hear this actually. I was just listening to a few CEOs that were talking on a panel, and the CEO of L'Oreal, she said, my most important C-suite member is the CHRO. It's my CHRO. That's my most important go-to partner. And the others are important too. Of course, they sit on the C-suite and then the executive team. But the CHRO is really the most important one that I go to most. And if you see, for example, CEO studies, more and more, the issues of talent, of skills, of culture, those are the most important ones, right? That they're worried about. It's no longer, well, do I have the right tech? Because you can buy the right tech, but do you have the right people that can actually use your tech, right? That's kind of what it's all about. And progress is slow and uneven. Well, we saw this in our study, because there's only 11% of companies that are systemic HR organizations. So roughly 1 in 10 organizations is actually going to systemic HR, where they can have an HR organization that can actually take advantage of all these opportunities and be that right-hand person to the CEO.
What are some rising and falling roles in HR?
Yeah, that was interesting. So we actually studied, when we did this big study, which was a 2-year, multi-year study, really, because we're still not done. We're still continue studying many different things on systemic HR. But when we did the initial study, we partnered with LinkedIn, and we got data from 7.5 million HR people on LinkedIn. So just let that number sink in. 7.5 million HR people just on LinkedIn. So and if you think about LinkedIn actually has 1 billion people on their platform overall. Like, this is 7.5 million people on LinkedIn that are in HR. And if you think about all the people that are actually not on LinkedIn, right? There's whole countries that don't use LinkedIn. There's many people that don't use LinkedIn because they just don't feel it's necessary for them or something like that. If you think about, like, what's the overall HR population in the world, it's probably like 3 times as much or something like that. It's probably over 20 million people that are working in HR. So we looked at all of these 7.5 million people, and then we looked at rising jobs and declining jobs. And we saw actually that the rising jobs are kind of a little bit it was a little bit surprising and disappointing what the more wanted jobs were, because there were rising jobs like accountant, things like that. HR were more like in the accounting and like going back to more the back office profession that HR had in the past, while some of the declining jobs were things like strategic HR business partner, something like that, which is one of the most important roles. So companies are not really prioritizing the right roles and skills as you would like to see it when you think about systemic HR.
There's a quote I pulled from the guide that says, when we compared HR capabilities to organizational growth, the picture was clear. Companies with the highest HR capabilities are growing much faster, end quote. What sticks out to you about these high growth organizations and how their HR functions function relative to low growth companies?
Yeah, so when we studied that, and that we actually did that based on our own HR capability model that has 96 HR capabilities across like 20 domain areas. And when we compared like organizational performance or growth rates to what capabilities HR functions were best at, we saw that the high growth organizations prioritized more these strategic forward-looking things that helped basically the company take advantage of all the opportunities ahead. So they were really like the most important, the most impactful one is developing leaders and managers. So HR has a huge opportunity to help develop leaders and managers in the organization. And if you think about it, that being very impactful makes a lot of sense, because leaders, if you think, for example, the CHRO being that right-hand person, that coach to the CEO, well, the CEO has a massive impact, of course, driving the company growth and the company success forward. So that kind of developing leaders and management, hugely important. Other things that were very, very important and very impactful in these high growth companies were like working on change management and change leadership and helping the organizations absorb change and being much more change adaptable, which of course in today's world, things are changing all the time, right? And the rate of change is going up all the time. So HR has this huge opportunity, but it's not usually like a traditional HR role in many organizations to help even with that and to support that. And the third one that also was very, very impactful was using the principles of organization design, basically to redesign the organization for the future. Hugely impactful. And if you think about AI, for example, massive impact to rethink operating models, rethink organizational structures, rethink roles and jobs and skills of every single job. So it doesn't surprise me at all that the high growth companies were very strong on that. But as we looked into our capability model and what skills people actually have, most people are not very good at all in all three of these things. So those are areas where high growth companies are best, yet most companies are not very good at those.
What do you see as the biggest challenges for organizations in moving towards this systemic HR? How do they overcome those challenges too?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on where you're at, because we laid out this 4-level maturity model. So, and before you get started on the journey, you need to know where you are, right? So if you want to get a map, basically, you need to know where you're starting. So it's not easy to say where what the wholesale the biggest obstacles are. It really depends on where you are today. If you're like the least impactful ones, where you don't really have any infrastructure, where you don't have any even common job roles or any kind of accountabilities, or no supporting technology, no kind of economies of scale or anything like that, you're going to work on that first. But if let's say you're already a little bit more advanced, I think the most impactful thing to work on is a few things. Well, first, getting leadership buy-in that systemic HR is actually the right model, because things will change. And some of these things might the business might not like. So, for example, if you're thinking about a new role of the HR business partner, where the HR business partner is not kind of just hand-holding managers to do like administrative things like put a job requisition in or write a job requisition or like interpret the employee survey results or any of those kind of things, but really helping them like think about their growth strategy, their business strategy, and how people's side can support that. Some managers might not like that. And if you don't have senior leadership support for that, it could get into the place where the senior executives say, well, hey, HR, we didn't sign up for that. Keep doing what you have been doing. We like you to be like in this corner where you just do like legal and compliance and administrative stuff, and we'll manage the rest. So like I think leadership support, critically important, getting support from the top. And leadership support also from the HR, CHRO, the Chief HR Officer, of course, critically important, because this can't be like a bottom-up movement alone. This has to be supported from leadership. So that's the first one. I think the second one is technology. Many companies are still struggling with having technology that's supporting the employees, not HR only. So getting employee-focused, employee experience-focused HR technology on board that also creates data and insights for you, as the HR organization needs to be much more data focused, critically important. And then I think the third thing is building HR capabilities. So really helping, like investing in the HR function, investing in upskilling and reskilling and developing HR people at all levels so they can actually take advantage of all of these new opportunities.
This guide is full of very bold statements about the systemic HR. And at the end of the guide, it says systemic HR is the only viable option to support companies in their ongoing business transformations. Why do you believe that?
Well, we believe that because we saw it actually with the data side. So if you see, for example, if we looked at kind of what the systemic HR, what outcomes systemic HR organizations have in transformation, in business adaptability. And we saw that these systemic HR organizations actually 7 times more likely to adapt well to change, for example. Well, if you're thinking about business transformation, adapting to change is kind of critical to that. Another statistic that I'd call out here, systemic HR organizations are 12 times more likely to accomplish high workforce productivity. And I know that productivity is kind of the name of the game and has been for the last few years. So how can the HR function of yesteryear that just basically worked off those like tickets as the IT department, they can support workforce productivity or change adaptability or innovation or anything like that. So the HR function having this really critical role has to change and do kind of work together in a much more systemic way because the problems are much more integrated and much more systemic as well.
Well said. There's so much in this guide. The guide is called The Definitive Guide to Human Resources, Systemic HR. There's a lot we didn't cover. Any like parting thoughts on this model or anything we didn't cover that you want to make sure that listeners hear about?
I think we covered lots of ground, Brandon. So thanks for all the great questions. I think my summarizing it would just be, I know sometimes it can sound scary or it can sound intimidating because you might think you're so far away from kind of systemic HR as you hear about this cross-functional alignment and working together in these cross-functional team, being much more a strategic business advisor, working on business problems as part of the business teams. My advice would be don't be intimidated because if you don't get started, obviously you'll never get anywhere. And there's something to do at any kind of level, where even if you're like in level 1, the least kind of impactful area, and actually more than 2 and 3 organizations are in the lower levels of systemic HR. So you're in good company. There's almost 40% of companies that are actually at the lowest level of systemic HR maturity. So don't feel like, everybody else has jumped ahead already. And just get started. Just start thinking about it and find a business problem, basically, where you could work across the team in a very different way, in a much more strategic and much more consultative way, using data, using insights, using analytics to solve the problems. And then when you have like one use case and some advocates in the business that say it actually works, it's going to be a much easier journey. So just do it, basically. Just get started.
My guest today has been Kathi Enderes, Senior Vice President, Research and Global Industry Analyst at the Josh Bersin Company and the co-author of the Definitive Guide to Human Resources Systemic HR. Kathi, it was a pleasure to have you on Transform Your Workplace.
It was great to be here, Brandon. Thanks so much.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.